Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a great day so far, wherever you might be in the world. Welcome to the M&E Thursday Talks. My name is Jennifer Howell, and I am the Senior Communications Associate for the DME for Peace project at Search for Common Ground. Today, I am very excited to welcome Jessica Baumgardner-Zuzik and Shaziya DeYoung, who are joining us from Alliance for Peacebuilding, where they have recently launched the Eirene Peacebuilding database. In today's discussion, Jessica will share with us how and why this database came about, and Shazia will demonstrate how we can best use Eirene to benefit our work. Before we get started, just a reminder that if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A portion. I will now hand it over to today's guests, Jessica and Shazia. Welcome to the Thursday Talks.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the very warm welcome and kind introduction. Shaziya and myself are so thrilled for such a wonderful turnout for the event, and really going to kind of move through a little quickly some of the background information, motivation, methodology, and then hand it over to Shaziya, who's going to handle our demo, because I think that's probably our most interesting concept of today's event. As Jennifer laid out, we're from Alliance for Peacebuilding. We're a network organization of more than 120 members throughout the world, operating in 153 countries. And realistically, our Learning and Evaluation Department, of which I'm our Senior Director, really focuses on three main areas, both to improve access to services for our members, as well as serve as a public good for the entire peacebuilding field. So we really focus on improving internal capacity for peacebuilding organizations so they can effectively design, monitor, and evaluate their programs. We work on helping to build connections so we can improve collaboration and push us towards a greater evidence-based programming. And we really work on conducting research that helps enrich the field writ large. And realistically, the Eirene Peacebuilding database that we're talking about today supports all three of these efforts. I'm happy to tell you that since the database's release about a week and a half ago, it's already been downloaded in 51 countries, 243 times, and previewed over 440 times. So we're very excited to welcome all of you today, and we'll be sending out a link to the database with instructions for citation and how to use following today's call as well. So just to give you a little background information on the database and how we got to where we are today, we really focused on naming it the Eirene Peacebuilding Database through inspiration from Greek mythology, where Eirene really represented the personification of peace. She's also often depicted with a scepter and a cornucopia as a reminder of that causality between peace and abundance, which is where our logo comes from. A little bit in terms of where we are and how we got here, I can tell you this project has been, a long process. We've been working on the database for over 2 years, and we really owe a debt of gratitude for the generous financial support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and have had multiple supporters through different researchers as well as experts and subject matter experts who kind of assisted us along the way. So what is the overall Eirene Peacebuilding database? The database is a comprehensive collection of 3,381 indicators that have been gathered from 2008 publicly available peacebuilding resources. And through our methodology, we carried out both a manual resource scraping. We also employed an intensive text mining approach and then a manual review process of the entire corpus from which to locate the 3,381 indicators, measures, and calculations that we use to develop the overall database. From this undertaking, we deduced 7 key outcomes that are being measured. This information was deduced from the available data rather than us applying that frame to the database going in. So the 7 key outcome areas that the database captures information on are dispute resolution, governance, perceptions of safety and security, resilience, social cohesion, trust, and violence reduction. Now, before I hand it over to Shaziya, who's going to go much more in depth in terms of how to demo and use the database in and of itself is actually very versatile, and it can assist with many different aspects of the field. One, we see it as a critical starting point for program design. Understanding what other programs have found in both specific locations, through particular approaches, with key target groups, etc., can help us get closer to an evidence-based design. Two, it really serves as an inspiration when you're working on designing your own M&E frameworks and creating program indicators. Understanding how other organizations, other programs are measuring these amorphous concepts like social cohesion, trust, or resiliency. And three, it can act as a starting point as we begin to define key indicators for the peacebuilding field and start to seek some forms of standardization across certain peacebuilding indicators. This can help us better aggregate impact and results across specific geographic scopes, thematic areas, conflict contexts, etc. I'm going to give 4 key caveats before I hand over to Shaziya that are really important as we begin to dive into the database, and then you go home from here today and start playing with it yourself. One, it's really important to understand that the indicators that are included in the database represent all available indicators. They are not indicative of a quality assessment of each indicator. So we're really staying true to the source materials. Two, the database does not purport that any single indicator would or should be used to evaluate complex outcomes or impact, but rather more robust indicators in combination should be considered. Three, the individual use, value, and application of each indicator is highly dependent upon context and should be considered prior to use. And then 4, in our effort to curate this information into a single database, the categorizations that have been given to indicators may differ from the context in which they were used in the original sources. So I'm going to hand this over to Shaziya to go through a demo, and we'll come back with a couple conversations then on some of our challenges and then some proposed next steps.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Jennifer, for having us today. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. And welcome to the Eirene expansive collection of 3,000.
Jennifer, hey, Shaziya, you're dropping out a little bit. Could you repeat what you just said, please? Thank you. Sorry about that.
Oh, yes. Oh, no worries. Well, basically, this is the Eirene Peacebuilding database, and as Jessica already mentioned, it is a comprehensive collection of 3,381 indicators that have been accumulated from 2008 publicly available peacebuilding resources. Now, these resources span from program evaluations to descriptions of research papers, and it also includes other relevant databases that we currently have in the peacebuilding field. Before I go into the specific features of the database, again, as Jessica already mentioned, I want to emphasize that at no point or step in the accumulation of data was there a quality assessment conducted. And our vision was to find these resources, collect the information within these resources, and organize it, making it more approachable and user-friendly. We want the database's audiences to be as broad as possible, ranging from implementers in the field to M&E practitioners to even evaluation specialists all across the globe. As you can see right now, the Eirene Peacebuilding database is a static database housed on an Excel sheet. We will touch upon this a little bit towards the end and steps forward, and we do plan on converting it into an interactive platform or dashboard, but we still have to hash out the details for that one. As it stands right now, it's on an Excel sheet, and what I will do today is walk you through the different sheets that we have on this Excel sheet that is the different features you can use with this database. As you can see, when you open the database, the first thing that you see is the cover page. Everything in here is already mentioned by Jessica and myself, and then within that, under that, you have just a breakup of what the database outline looks like. What we will start with from the tabs at the bottom over here, we're going to start with the Sources tab, which is this one, and here. So what this sheet does is from the 2008 publicly available resources that were found, only the sources in which we found indicators are listed here with the attached links over here to the original source documents. So it has, as you can see, the title of the project, the country in which it was operating, the year of the project, as well as the organization of the project. A little fun fact about the database. Currently, it covers a total of 86 countries that span from Afghanistan to Zambia to Albania and Mexico. What we do have is one of our features. You can see on the tabs and sheets, there's a country sheet. So we have if we click it, we have a comprehensive list of all the countries covered within this database. So if someone were to go into the database and want to look up programs being implemented or research studies being conducted in a specific country, all they need to do is go to the country tab, look at all the countries covered within this database, and then go to the actual database and filter out for that country. I'm gonna just go back to the sources tab again now, and yeah. So say we want another approach towards the database. Say you don't have a specific country of focus, but you have a specific kind of program that you're looking for. So for example, a program that does work with youth or with women or with community leaders. And to cover that search criteria, what we have also is target groups, as you can see over here. So all the target groups that are covered within these documents or resources or programs are covered in this column. And again, we do have a comprehensive list for all the target groups housed within this database in the target groups tab. So if you were to click on this tab in this sheet, this will give you a comprehensive list of all the target groups. Sorry, let me just center that. There we go. What I do want to do is go back to the sources page now. And say you wanted still another approach towards the database. If you were looking for a broad overarching approach, like you wanted to just simply look for what other programs are out there across the globe that do similar work to the kind of work you're interested in, maybe to see what their program approach is or who their target groups are, where in the world do they operate. For that, we have our source description and we have tags. What we wanted to do was to be able to give users a snapshot of what the program or document covered. So we first started creating source descriptions, as you can see in this column, that followed the format of doing what, through what mechanisms, processes, programs, etc., and then to achieve what. That is the broader overarching goal to which this project is contributing. So for example, over here, let's say this one. So let's say this one. So let's say this one is strengthening the role of women in leadership positions through what? Through the development of skills, knowledge, and attitude of women leaders and increasing women's leadership networks and alliances. And to what? What is the broad overarching goal? It is to encourage women to play a more effective role in social integration and local government of the community. Now, from these succinct source descriptions, any themes that emerge were then converted into searchable tags, which is in this column. So all the themes that arose from these snapshots were converted into searchable tags. And then for that, again, we have a comprehensive list in the tags sheet or tab. And these are all the tags that are covered under our database. We tried to be mindful of the various ways in which people would try to look these up. However, there is a lot of information covered in this database. And so looking through the tags or these comprehensive lists first before diving into the database will definitely help optimize your experience and use of the database. I'm going to quickly go back to our sources page. And now, as you can see, we've covered target group, source description, tags, the date published, implementing organization, title, and country. Now, these features that we already looked at, they offer information on the program specifically, which is one big component of the database. However, there is another major component in the original motivation of this database is the M&E component, monitoring and evaluation, learning and evaluation component. So within each of these programs, any and every indicator that we found were pulled and categorized, as Jessica has already mentioned, under 7 main program areas. Now, because these areas and groups were so large, for example, violence reduction, social cohesion, they're large topics and themes. Within those 7 main areas, we also had subgroups and sub areas. And again, for those, we have a comprehensive list under your area subgroups tab and sheet. So as you can see, your program areas and subgroups. You have dispute resolution, governance, perceptions of safety and security, resilience, social cohesion, trust, and violence reduction. Within each of these, as you can see, you have subgroups. Now, I will just run one example by you within, for example, governance. And under governance, you have access to justice, anti-corruption initiatives, attitudes towards democracy, attitudes towards foreign policy, and these are single subgroups. However, you will also come across multiple subgroups like this one. Community Security Forces Relations. Now, what happened when we created subgroups? Within specific subgroups, we also had so much content that followed such emergent themes that we decided to have a sort of informal subgroups. And so this is what you're seeing over here. Within Community Security Forces Relations, if someone were to look at that specific indicator category, they can look up Community Security Forces Relations and all of these will pop up. However, if your scope is much more refined and you're specifically looking change in relations between community and security forces, then we do have that feature to refine your search specifically to that narrowed scope. And so that is what those subgroups are. Another thing that we really struggled with, and which was one of the biggest challenges for this database regarding these areas, was in a certain context, an indicator was used, for example, violence reduction programming, whereas in another program, the same or a similar indicator was used for, say, example, social cohesion programming. So Jessica and I really struggled with how to visualize this, that is showing the interconnectivity within this field, and at the same time not having rows and rows of just duplicate indicators so that they cover additional criteria. One really good example for this is if you look at resilience. The field itself struggles to have a solid, all-inclusive definition of resiliency programming, and many themes that existed across social cohesion, governance, security, trust, all of them seem to sort of fit within this resiliency framework. If there is a stronger cohesion in the community, those communities are said to be more resilient towards violence. Or if there is a high level of trust within a community or with security forces, then it leads to a much more resilient community. And so as you can see, there's such recurring themes, and we did for a fact want to put together this interconnected feature in our field on this platform, but we kind of struggled with how to do it. We're happy to report that we were able to do it, but I will leave that for an example that we will do once we just run through all the features. Our first example will cover how we have represented this interconnected nature. So before we dive into the database, I just want to briefly go back all our tabs that we've gone through now. We've had the sources tab that we've gone through extensively. We have the program areas and subgroups. We have our target groups. We have the tags that were the searchable tags that emerged from themes arising within the source descriptions. And the source descriptions were snapshots of the documents and resources. And again, we have a comprehensive list of all the countries housed within this database. That being said, let's go into the database. So this is the Eirene Peacebuilding database. As you can see, everything, all the columns in this database is the same as all these sheets that we've gone through. What I will do is run through a few examples now, and the first one being that interconnected nature and how we represented it on this database. So say I want to work, or I want to look at programs that work exclusively with women. So what I'll do is I'll go to target groups. I'll look for a W and say yes. So we have these three categories that do work with women, some more specific than the others. So when I'll go back to my database, I'll click on my target group. I'll click on my target group and I'll look for women. Okay, so these are all the entries that come up. So we have 253 records that pop up with programs that work with women. If you just go to the search drag down arrow, if you click on that, that will give you a whole list of all the programs we have within the database that work with women. As you can see, these are a lot. And let's try maybe narrowing our search down a little. So let's look at what these countries look like. So again, we have them completely across the globe. Let's maybe choose just one country. Let's maybe choose Liberia. Okay, so that narrows down our search a little. Again, I'm going to go down to my drop menu and see, okay, we have one program that works with women in Liberia, and it is a baseline assessment report. That being said, let's go and have a look which areas are covered by our indicators in this program. Again, if you do the drag down arrow, you're going to have all the options. So we have governance resilience, social cohesion, violence reduction, and perceptions of safety and security. Now, when you see these slashes, that is our way of representing the interconnectivity within these indicators. For example, this means that this indicator, according to the emerging themes, was categorized under governance as well as resilience. This one was categorized under social cohesion as well as resilience. This one was categorized under violence reduction as well as perceptions of safety and security. So let's maybe click on one and have a look at what this is. So governance or resilience, and the area subgroup is government capacity. Okay, and then if we look at the indicator, this is what the indicator is: percentage reporting, police support, sexual and gender-based violence survivors. The measure used for this is, can police support sexual and gender-based violence survivors? Your measure options are yes, no, don't know, no response. And then how do you calculate? Your calculating range is percentage saying yes. And how do you collect this information is through a survey, or at least how this information was collected in this program was through a survey. Now, say, for example, I want to, under this program, we have this one that covers governance and resilience. Say I want to only look at governance programming. What is there in this database that covers governance? And so I will clear all my filters, and this is a handy dandy shortcut to know. If you type in Alt-AC, all your filters will be cleared, which is super helpful given that you don't have to go looking for which filters on and off and undo all of them. All you do is Alt-AC and it'll clear all your filters. And that's what I'm about to do. There we go. So all our filters are cleared. Now we want to look at governance. I'm going to do my drag down arrow and I'm going to look for governance. Okay. As you can see, governance as well as the similar themes also pop up. And then under area subgroups, these are all the area subgroups being covered under governance right now. As you can see, like we did the community security forces relations, rule of law also has a lot of subgroups. So maybe let's look at rule of law. Sorry, typo. Okay, so right now for governance under rule of law, we have 200 indicators across this database. These are all the subgroups also that you find. You have human rights, you have confidence in justice system, timely response, case management, local justice. So maybe let's further narrow it. Let's do rule of law and let's look at confidence in justice systems. Okay, so these under rule of law, only confidence in justice systems, we have 50 indicators. So we can hop right on over and look at what these indicators are. So one is confidence in community justice system. You have the measure being how much confidence do you have in community shuras or jugas. Measure options are a great deal, a fair amount, not very much, no confidence at all, refused. And the calculation range. Now, there are certain documents and programs that show how their data was disaggregated, and this is one of them. So this is disaggregated on gender, all these three. You have other similar indicators that have data disaggregated on location, geographic location, on ethnicity, on identity groups. And all of that is captured within our calculation range. And then the collection methodology is a survey again. If you go down to this one and see NA, you will come across it in the database and it means not available. What we did is pulled out as much information we could find in these source documents. However, there are some that share the measure with you and don't tell you how it's calculated. Some share the indicator, but not the measure or the measure options. So whatever information we could find, we have put on this database, and whatever information wasn't made available, we have just put an NA to represent its lack of availability. So this is what we have for governance under rule of law. Now say we want another approach. Again, I'm going to do Alt-AC, clear all my filters, and now say I want to look at a specific kind of programming under my tags. So I can again click down my arrow and just have a look at what all is out there. And here, maybe let's look at behavior change. Okay. So we have 3 resources that deal specifically with behavior change. Your implementing organization is only search for common ground for all 3 programs, and then it is in South Sudan and DRC. So let's maybe look at South Sudan. So in South Sudan, and this is again another great example, what we do have is a baseline assessment and a final evaluation. We have a baseline assessment and a final evaluation for the same document. Now, say for example, under the source description, if you read the description and it seems super important to you or very similar to the work you're looking for, the other feature that we do have is all we got to do is see what number this document is, 440. We go to our sources tab. We look for 440, which is here. And then, like I said earlier, that these are linked to the original source documents. So all you have to do is click on them and it will open up the original document. And now you can read specific information that you might be looking for in the original source documents that was not covered by the database. And that is it for me. Thank you so much for having us. And I think I'm going to pass it back to Jessica to just briefly touch upon challenges and key steps forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaziya. I know that we have a lot of questions, so I don't want to take too much time in our last 15 minutes. Just to highlight some key challenges and what our proposed steps are moving forward. One, a couple of key challenges. Obviously, we faced many, but I'm going to highlight only about 4 here. One, indicator formatting. We don't have a prescribed format for peacebuilding indicators, and there were a lot of different formats, which obviously had implications for our subgroups and how we categorize up from there. But that's a question for reflection for the field. Do we want to have best standards or best practices around indicator formatting, or is that always going to be more free form? We also, as you saw, have all the resources currently housed on our website. I don't know if you noticed that when we clicked on the link. The purpose behind that right now is to make sure that we don't have broken links and you're able to reference back to those original sources. We also just have to highlight the fact that of 2008 publicly scraped resources, only 12% of those included direct indicators and measures. That's a problem, and we at AFP really believe that indicators and tools should not be considered intellectual property. It does all of us a disservice when we're not understanding the best practices and what other programs are learning when it comes to best forms of measurement. Finally, really thinking about what are the outcomes for peacebuilding programs? What are those higher level changes that we're attempting to change? We really encounter this issue quite frequently, from all the way down to the field trying to describe our M&E frameworks, all the way up to policy and advocacy efforts when we're trying to make the case for peace, both to funders as well as policymakers. And when we're at Congress or on the Hill and they're asking us, well, what does peacebuilding do? And that's a problem for us, and we struggled with that definition through the database. And then, of course, thinking about, is there an opportunity for standardizing key peacebuilding indicators, particularly around certain prescribed outcomes? That leads us a little bit more to some of our proposed next steps. As Shaziya highlighted, right now, the indicator database is a static database in Excel, and we're looking for ways and options to turn this into a digital database so it's more easily searchable, could be more user-friendly. Of course, that would lead to future iterations, perhaps with multiple language options. You'll see and notice that we didn't define the different types of indicators. Were they output indicators? Were they outcome, or were they impact? There's a lot of questions around why we didn't do that, and it's definitely something we're considering for future efforts and how we want to move the database forward. We are also thinking about, how do we expand the database? We stopped collecting resources at the end of 2018, and there's been a lot of great research since then. How do we include and update those new indicators in? Are there ways to make it more of a participatory database where we could have individuals adding comments or key learning for specific indicators? When they've tried an indicator in the field, what did they learn from it? Was it good? Was it bad? Why? What could others necessarily need to know if they were reflecting upon a certain indicator in their own work? And then also, our biggest next step beyond that is really starting to think about doing a beginner level or foundational level quality assessments across the database. We think the first step in that process are frequency checks, but of course, keeping in mind that frequency of use of an indicator does not necessitate quality, but it does provide a critical starting point for us as we start to think about, what do key peacebuilding indicators look like across the field, and is there any chance for some standardization? So I'm going to leave it there and open up to questions to all of you. They can be anything from different ways to use the database, thoughts on next steps. As I said, we'll be following up with each of you who registered and sharing with you links to the database, as well as some critical information on citing it and how we purport you could use it moving forward.
All right, thank you, Jessica. We will now open up today's presentation for questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar. You can submit a question in one of two ways. The first is through the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. Just to note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace so that those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and discussion. All right, I'm just being aware of time. Let's get started. We have a few questions coming in. One of the first questions was covering sort of how you define how your areas are defined and where might people using the database access those definitions.
Great, thank you. So the areas were defined through a deduction method from the database, really understanding when we talk about dispute resolution, what does that comprehensively mean in terms of how individuals in the field are assessing that level of change. Right now, some of the key definitions in the database are covered in the instructions tab. However, a comprehensive definition for each of those 7 areas is not currently included. It's a really great question and something we ourselves have considered. And part of the reason why that hasn't been strongly and definitionally defined is that we really see it as an open process and that it's a continuous process of refinement. We definitely have some thoughts on creating some kind of, I don't want to say standard because I think that then becomes the like be all end all definition, but some more broader definitions of how we define that using the data. So thank you for that point, and we'll definitely look into how better to kind of share that with users.
Thank you, Jessica. And that was from Ono Wang. We have a question coming in from Tracy Cossey. Tracy says, I see the UK is not represented. Do you have plans to represent that at some point in the future?
I guess in the question, I'm not quite certain how the UK is not represented, but the original source documents were, if we're referencing resources were not coming from the UK, the original source documents were scraped far and wide from online available websites, both international as well as domestic. There are quite a few French surveys and resource tools that were also considered. So it could be just a simple challenge of the database that we weren't finding available resources at the time that we did the scraping. In terms of if you're looking at the map, that maybe just reference that we hadn't had it downloaded yet in the UK. So I'm not quite sure which one we're referencing, but definitely that's something in terms of adding new resources. As we really reflect upon how to move this forward, we would be looking for even targeted calling to specific peacebuilding programs around the world to make sure that we are including individual resources from both grassroots all the way up to international NGOs.
Thank you for that. And Tracy, if you have further questions or would like to clarify, please feel free to send another question in. I have a question from Dayton Maxwell, formerly of USAID. Dayton asks, did you access DoD data?
So we accessed some DoD data that was publicly available. Again, we're so limited because we didn't do an open call for resources. We were particularly looking at USAID's DEC and the Development Evaluation Clearinghouse and pooling resources in that regard. So some DoD resources could have fallen through in that regard, but anything that was privately held, we would not be including.
Fantastic. I have a question from Ted Holmquist. Ted asks, are there indicators in the database that reflect collected outcomes that cover the humanitarian, development, and peacebuilding sectors? If so, how can we find them?
That is an excellent question. So one, I can tell you that, of course, there are some indicators that are highly relevant, like rule of law, that would not necessarily be exclusively a peacebuilding indicator and would have huge implications towards development work in particular. Governance work, as we know, is not necessarily just a peacebuilding theme, but a lot of other organizations and sectors address it. We ourselves do not capture and prescribe that this is a relevant indicator towards, say, rapid response, humanitarian, or disaster relief or development writ large, but it is actually something we're beginning to explore. We've been talking a bit more in depth with Interaction and thinking about how we could start to broaden the database, because there are very relevant indicators in here being used in peacebuilding that have implications to other sectors.
Thank you. I have a question from Franklin Coelho. Franklin is of Dexis Consulting Group. Do any of these source report on a frequent basis, annual, quarterly, biannual, for example?
So because it's not actually capturing the data that was reported on it, like did you quarterly report on the number of interactions, say, between civil society and government meetings, just as a random example there, we're not capturing how many times they necessarily calculated that data. Now, if, as you saw in Shaziya's example, they issued baseline, midline 2, end line surveys, all of those would be replicated in here with the same indicator to show that it was an indicator that had a frequency associated with it. In the data collection approaches, there are sometimes, if it was included in the original source, implications on this was monthly, this is collected on a monthly basis, this would have been an annual measure, or how it was calculated using annual data. But we don't necessarily go through and report on the actual data that would tell you that this necessarily was a monthly collection or an annual collection. But all of that, we hope, in many ways, is captured in the original source documents, and would be something, if there were indicators of interest, you could look back through and see what type of information they had.
Thank you. Raquel Leandro, and my apologies for mispronouncing any names today, was wondering, just if, again, asking about sources and where you're getting them, if the UN is represented in your source material.
Yeah, so we definitely looked through some of the UN databases that we had available to pool evaluations, particularly within UN PBSO and DPKO, and seeing what types of evaluations they were publishing. I think one of the limitations, of course, in using a publicly available database and doing a strong methodology through a free resource scraping is that you will inherently miss resources. And one of our key kind of next steps in thinking about that's really of interest to us is the expansion of the database, not only because, you know, we critically missed resources that should have been included and should have been captured, to new resources that have come out since 2019 and aren't included here, as well as how could we go about thinking about including resources that previously maybe weren't released but are being shared with us in terms of tools. The value of a comprehensive database is obviously how comprehensive it is. And we are seeking many opportunities to expand that and try and make it as, you know, open sourced and as, I would say, fulfilling as possible in that regard.
Great. Ona Wang asks, other than reading source material, how can someone assess the quality or the efficiency of the indicator to decide whether or not to include this indicator in their programs and or research?
So perfect question. And I think that this is where things start to get more tricky. And I think there are limitations in terms of just seeing indicators that others are using to assess, was it well done? Did they themselves conducting quality checks on it, or, you know, back checks to determine the efficacy of said indicator, as well as obviously, as we highlighted in terms of key caveats, the individual use of an indicator is often highly contextualized. So I wish that I could tell you really, really easily that yes, here is a, you know, a green, yellow, red type system where we say this is not a great indicator, this is an okay indicator, this is an extraordinary indicator. That's something that we're exploring for the future. And I often believe, and we talk about indicator and M&E framework development, that so much about this skill set comes from exposure and experience. So part of it is trying to understand, what are others doing? What type of frequency checks are happening? If we see that, you know, there are 20 organizations all using a similar indicator for trust, well, frequency could mean a lot of things there. It could mean that they all believe it's good, but that doesn't necessarily mean or, you know, indicate that it is. So our kind of goal in the next kind of steps and phases, once we're able to get it digitized, is more of a comprehensive reflection on what would indicate or show some indication towards quality. As Shaziya highlighted, and I also caveated really quickly, these are just every indicator we could find, and we ourselves are not voting on their quality. So I hate to tell you, the long and the short of it is, you have to do your research, and you do have to do a comprehensive lit review and think about what would be appropriate in your context and situation, and how could you either find an indicator already in use or potentially reflect upon how could you modify it to the contextual requirements you have.
Thank you. With just a couple minutes left, I'd like to get to our last two questions. So Elizabeth Milano asks, have you thought about doing an analysis about the most common indicators used in peacebuilding M&E, and what may be the advantage and disadvantages of its use?
Absolutely. And that's one of our exciting kind of next steps now that we have the database in more of a formatted form that is accessible to a variety of researchers. And I would honestly reach out and encourage other researchers who are themselves interested in conducting some preliminary analyses to reach out to Shaziya and myself. Our emails are listed on the front screen right now. We definitely would love to hear from you. We have a feedback form on the website we'll send out for you as well if you encounter issues or are looking to potentially collaborate on future research. We would love to hear from you. And we, of course, as an open source organization, want to identify and collaborate with others who themselves are interested.
Wonderful. And if you could just quickly cover how, this is a question coming in, how different is it measuring peace outcomes from other social aspects of human life?
Wow. I think anytime
All
you
at the last minute, sorry.
Yeah, it's a huge question. I'll try to answer it in 30 seconds or less. I think anytime that we start to look at attitudinal changes, which often are more of our social development or psychological or peace-oriented indicators, we run into a lot of difficulties. Other fields are making huge progress, and I think the peacebuilding field has a lot to learn from behavioral science, from psychology, from social development, that we could start to apply to our own field. So while I think that there are differences, I actually think that there are a lot of similarities, and we need to work harder at understanding how other fields are advancing so that peacebuilding can come along with them.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for sticking with us, and thank you especially Jessica for handling my rapid fire questioning, which was such grace. Now I'm going to close us for today. It looks like we've reached the end of this edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. I want to thank you all again for joining us and asking so many thoughtful questions. If you would like to listen back to our discussion or share it with your colleagues, the recording will be posted online on the M&E Thursday Talk page on DME for Peace later today. So we invite you to continue the discussion online in the comments. Additionally, if you think of questions later on, Jessica and Shaziya are happy for you to email them directly using the email addresses that you've seen during the presentation. And just a heads up, you will be receiving an email soon from Alliance for Peacebuilding with a link to access the database. I know a lot of people are very excited to start working their way through the database. So just to preview next week, in next week's M&E Thursday Talk, we will be discussing with Dr. Jeffrey Conroy-Cooks the effect that media, especially talk radio, can and does have on tolerance and engagement in conflict fragile environments. So check our website and be on the lookout for our emails and social media promotions so that you can register and join us again. We should be sending these out by the end of this week. So with that, I thank you all again for joining us, and specifically, again, extend a thank you to Shaziya and Jessica. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I will see you all next time, same place.